On behalf of the ARNEC Secretariat, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar. I'm Evelyn Santiago, and I'm the Executive Director of the ARNEC Secretariat. The focus of this webinar is very important as we try to unpack how climate change exacerbates flooding and how this affects young children. But before we get into the details of this topic, allow me to spend the next 5 to 7 minutes to share with you how this webinar is related to the overall advocacy of ARNEC on ECD and climate change. If you can put up the slides, please, Jay. All right, so our main narrative in ARNEC is that young children are the most vulnerable when it comes to the impacts of climate change. And yet, they are also the most valuable in addressing these impacts. As such, we strongly believe that ECD is an effective pathway to addressing climate resilience and sustainable development. Next, please. ARNEC has been working on this intersection of ECD and climate change since 2019 in various ways. No? We build awareness, we develop advocacy materials for the use, particularly for the use of our partners in the country. And we lead regional conversations on the importance of putting young children at the center of climate actions and environmental protection. Next, please. The rationale is very clear on why ARNEC is committed to this advocacy. Young children are the most affected by climate change. Climate risk, such as air pollution, flooding, heat waves, rising sea levels, extreme weather, and disaster events impact all the domains of nurturing care, be in health, nutrition, safety and security, early learning, and responsive caregiving. I won't get into the details of this slide, but you can see that each of the domains of the nurturing care is actually affected by climate change. Next slide, please. The impact of climate change is not even, and our region is more vulnerable, as evidenced by the recent studies, as you can see in this slide. So you can see some of the data and information related to flooding, air pollution, and the risk of rising sea levels, particularly in this region. Next, please. As such, ARNEC conducted a landmark scoping study in 2022 with the University of Wollongong and in partnership with Save the Children and UNICEF. This study looked in more detail how climate change affects young children with the nurturing care as the framework. And it also looked at the gaps in terms of policies, research, and financing. Not going into the details, but I want to share with you some of the key recommendations that came out of that study, which revolves around the need to strengthen and redefine climate policies, financing, and approaches to consider the needs of young children. The last bullet point, which is actions at multiple levels, is very important. It talks about building resilience within families, focusing on childcare, preschools, and ECD settings, supporting and enabling communities to be engaged, creating resilient child-centered programs and services, and looking at policy and financing in terms of climate, actions and discourses. Next, please. As a result then of this scoping study, and as we consulted various partners in the region, we've done, a framework. We've came up with our ECD and climate framework for action anchored on 4 action pillars. One is on advocacy. The second is the need to have a knowledge hub that will consolidate all the ECD and climate related resources that we have in the region and even globally, and particularly those coming out, from the countries, research and evidence and capacity building, for advocacy. As part of that framework, we have produced a lot of environment and climate advocacy resources. And some of those you will hear some of this advocacy materials, just like the flooding fact sheet. Next, we've also generated research and evidence through micro research done in 5 countries. So we have engaged our partners in the countries to undertake micro research in Pakistan, Indonesia, Philippines, India, Bhutan, and there is also one going on in Bangladesh. This research studies serve as entry points for advocacy and awareness raising on the issue of ECD and climate change, in the respective countries. Next, please. This is just a sample of the capacity building, that we do in partnership, with the countries. So we've done what we call the ECD and Climate 101 training in Indonesia late last year. And this year, we've done one in Bhutan. And there are also other trainings, coming up in the region and in the countries. So again, as part of our um, objective to build capacity on the intersection of ECD and climate change. Next, please. This is just a sample of how the advocacy is shaping in the countries. This is one in Indonesia. So with ARNEC support, the Holistic Integrated ECD Coalition in Indonesia is leading an advocacy campaign on building, awareness about the impacts of climate change on young children and how this is relevant to their specific context. So they do a lot of social media campaigns, a lot of advocacy materials and webinars for ECD practitioners and policymakers as well. Next, please. With all of this, we are working on a lot of activities that will strengthen this advocacy in the region. We are establishing a regional working group and an advisory group to provide strategic, direction and support to this advocacy. We continue to build the ECD and climate toolkit. Again, the fact sheets are part of the toolkit. We continue to build capacity of the countries in terms of holding country workshops and also regional trainings on ECD and climate change. And last but not the least, we are looking for resources to start building on a knowledge hub that again will host the various ECD and climate resources that we have in the region for the use, of the countries in their specific advocacy on addressing, the impacts of climate change on young children. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do in ARNEC, in support of this advocacy. Again, this webinar is a part of this regional initiative of ARNEC. With that, I would like to turn the floor to Neelima Chopra, our program and partnership specialist, who will be moderating this webinar. Over to you, Neelima.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you so much for sharing the context and sharing the initiatives, the work that we are doing on ECD and climate. And I saw in one of the chats, there's an inquiry regarding where can we access this all this material that Evelyn has talked about. So you can access it on our website, and we can also share the link of the website in the chat box. So let's, I would like to now introduce our esteemed panelists. We have a great panel. We have Lynn. Lynn, if you can, when I just introduce you, please switch on the camera and you can say hi. Lynn Tang is the Director of Programs, Environmental, Climate, and Urban Health at Vital Strategies, an international public health organization. And Lynn has worked on important projects on air pollution, lead poisoning, on non-communicable diseases. And it's a great honor to be working with Lynn and Vital Strategies on the fact sheets. We also have Nazar. Nazar Khalid is a joint doctoral candidate in demography and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and a research affiliate with RICE, which is a Research Institute for Compassionate Economics. And his research focuses on education, health, social inequality, and the environment. So it's great to have you, Nazar, and he'll be talking about his research and sharing insights from the research and the other activities that are happening at University of Pennsylvania. We also have our guest from Bangladesh, Mourie Chowdhury. She is education specialist at UNICEF Bangladesh, and her portfolio focuses on early learning and education in emergency. And Mourie co-leads the National Education Cluster and supports government to coordinate various education interventions and responses for affected children in Bangladesh. Great to have you, Mourie. We have our panelist from Pakistan, Baela Raza Jamil. She is the CEO of Idara-e-Taleem-o-Aagahi, which is ITA, and the founder of the Pakistan Learning Festival. And Baela has served as the technical advisor to the Federal Ministry of Education and has also actively promoted ECE, girls' education, gender equality in Pakistan. And she's a long-standing friend of ARNEC, so it's great to have you, Baela. We also have Mariel Joy Sampang. She's the ECCD advisor for Save the Children's Philippines. Joy serves as co-chair of the regional ECCD working group in Save the Children, and she leads innovative ECCD programs focused on gender equality, social inclusion, climate change, and leadership development. So it's great to have you, Joy. Thank you, all the experts, for joining in this webinar and sharing your valuable insights. And before I turn it over to the experts that we have on our panel, I would just like to share a brief context to why we are talking about flooding. So I'll share my slide. Yeah. So and if you've been following the news, you'll know that there was last week there was a flash flood in Nepal, which in which 200 plus people were died, and it affected so many other people in Nepal. We've had flooding in Bangladesh. We've had again typhoons and cyclones in Philippines, in Vietnam, and Laos, which have caused devastating flooding. And this is not restricted to the region. We are also hearing of Hurricane Helene in USA, which again has caused mass destruction. And also in Eastern Europe, we've heard about these flooding situations. So if you're wondering, climate change is the cause of it, then to an extent, yes, climate change is impacting flooding. And what we understand, the UN's IPCC, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it says that although it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact reason for a climate event, but we've seen that climate change, exacerbates the variables which lead to the flooding risks and increase in flooding. And the main cause for this is that um, a warmer world leads to a higher precipitation level. So if it's the global warming leads to a warmer atmosphere, and a warm atmosphere holds and dumps more water than usual. And we know that every 1 degree increase, degree Celsius increase in temperature in the atmospheric temperature, there is 1% increase in the water vapors that are there. So basically saying that, this increase in temperature is causing higher precipitation levels in the atmosphere, which results in higher rainfalls and more intense rainfalls, causing the flooding situations. Also, we see that climate change is causing a lot more of these climatic events. For example, hurricanes. In future, we'll see more hurricanes. And again, experts have shared that the future hurricanes will dump more water, up to 37% more water will be dumped because, again, of this climate change issue. And these flood situations, these flooding events are more frequent, and they are, we are seeing that events of intense rainfall, which were more common, maybe which occurred maybe in once in a 10-year period or once in 100 years, they are now becoming more common. And this will increase as the global warming, as the climate change is taking more effect. And again, experts say that, bringing or limiting the global temperature, the average global temperature within the 1.5 degree centigrade Celsius range is a very effective and an important way of averting the increase in these flooding events that we are seeing around the world. So yes, climate change is impacting flooding. Now, flooding also, we know it is a very devastating climate event where we see a lot of destruction of the infrastructure. We see that it, degrades the fertile soil, the top layer of the soil, which leads to agricultural losses. It also impacts the wildlife habitats, and definitely it has a lot of impact on the human lives and livelihood. And we are seeing that these devastating effects are seen more and more often. More number of people are exposed to these flooding risks, and there are various reasons for this. Climate change being one, then rapid urbanization, where there's a lot of construction on the flooding plains. And we find that a lot of water bodies have dried up, and there's a lot of construction happening in those areas. So over the period of time, the population that is exposed to flooding has increased, as and you can see the numbers on the screen. A very important part on this is that these flooding risks or the events are, the population. We are seeing that although it affects everybody around the globe, but there are regions which are more vulnerable, and these countries or these locations which are in low and middle income countries, they are affected more by these. And through this webinar, in the presentations that we are having later on, we'll be talking about these factors also, and how the vulnerabilities play up for certain regions. The Asia Pacific region is again, it is there everywhere, but Asia Pacific region is more affected because of the high density, the more number of people, more population, and again, we see that a lot of people are residing in the flood affected areas in the Asia Pacific region. Now, how does flooding therefore impact, children? We've seen it impacts the infrastructure, people, livelihood, but specifically for children, we know that it is a great risk. UNICEF has said that climate crisis is a child rights crisis, and as per the Children's Climate Risk Index, which is given by UNICEF, climate change is one of the greatest threats which is facing young children. And why so children? Because children are more physically vulnerable, they are more physiologically vulnerable, and they're also, more at risk of death. And again, globally, we see that a number of children are now exposed to floods, which might be caused because of the riverine or coastal flooding, or because of the cyclones and the typhoons that we are seeing again and again. And again, the risk in Asia Pacific region is considerably high. Not only the scale, but we also see, as Evelyn also mentioned, flooding and climate change, they are impacting all the different components of the nurturing care framework. So they're affecting the young children in different ways. And I'll not elaborate more on this slide because we have lots coming up. Lynn will also be explaining about it. And we have in the subsequent presentations also, we'll be talking about it. I want to focus on something a little different, although we talk about these impacts of flooding on children, uh, what are the children's experiences of flooding? We know that children experience a lot of loss. There is loss of loved ones, there's loss of your home, the house that you're staying in, home, your precious possessions. Then there are disruptions in the social and the social community, in your friendships. And there is also this lengthy recovery period. It's not that the flood water recedes and you are back to normal. It takes a long time to clear up the mess. And this also causes a lot of disruption or stress among children. Then there is this sense of isolation, difficulty adjusting with your peers and in the community. And often we see that there are certain pre-existing stressors, like we said, certain communities are more vulnerable, and these children might already be going through some significant stress or issue in their life, and which is now compounded by the flooding that has happened in their region. So it's very important that we understand what are the children's experiences of flooding and document them. And I'll come to why it is important to document them also. But this is a study which I wanted to share. This was done in Jammu and Kashmir region of India, where floods happened in 2014. And this study, it documented what children went through, and it talks about the initial reactions to shock, to, the feeling of intrusion, to the feeling of being sad, anxiety. So all these are, what children experience, and it's very important to be talking about these experiences as well. I hope you are able to read the various, responses of children and how they experienced flooding. Another very interesting resource which I found was the Flood Snakes and Ladder. Now, this is a game which has been developed by social scientists at the Lancaster University, and this involved researching on various effects of flooding on communities, on adults and children, and they've converted it into a game using real data. So they've used real pictures, they've used real experiences, and it's a game. You roll the dice and you go through this. So it again helps us understand what the children are going through. And this particular game is available on this website, and it is suitable for children 10 years and above. So, why am I sharing about these experiences or documenting the experiences of children? Because it is important to understand that, we often say that children are resilient, naturally resilient. They bounce back from, these events automatically or naturally. And that is a myth which often hinders the recovery process. So it is incorrect to assume that children will recover automatically. They do go through a lot of trauma and stress, and which we need to understand and document. Then again, also understanding that how children experience is different for everybody. How they experience flooding or the impact of it is different for different children. Often it has been found that certain drama, games, or focusing on sensory perceptions tend to help children, and therefore it is also again important to document what children are going through or experiencing. Flooding awareness in education, definitely, but also including children's experiences in part of this education process is important. And also a very important point that, it has been found that children who have experienced flooding, they can also act as they can contribute in the flooding response. They have a different understanding of how flooding happens, and they can further help in this process. So it's very important to have a participatory approach. Um, so lastly, I would just like to focus on, integrating how social and emotional learning can be integrated for climate change, because looking at climate change from a very scientific, it is a very technical aspect, it is a very cognitive construct, but also we have to understand that there are emotional links, and to understand that link is very important, and to make use of it in all our programs. So, whether we're talking about empathy, resilience, or we're talking about compassion, about responsible decision making, this needs to be part of our response to climate change and flooding also. So going forward, this was the context, and there are various questions. I'm sure these must be coming to your mind. We'll try and share presentations, discuss on a few of these issues. There are other questions that might pop up in your mind. Please do feel free to share them in the question and answers and the section, and we'll definitely answer them. So with this context, I will hand it over to Lynn to talk about the advocacy brief. Lynn, over to you.
Thanks so much, Neelima, and thanks, Evelyn, as well. I just want to echo that it's been a fantastic experience so far working with ARNEC in trying to elevate the importance of environmental and climate hazards on young children. So for this presentation today, I'll talk a bit about our flooding advocacy brief, or flooding fact sheet, that was launched earlier this month. And this QR code, if you scan it through your mobile phones now, you can actually directly access the page to download the brief. Next slide, please. So this brief is available both on the ARNEC and Vital Strategies website. It is designed for a non-technical audience. The primary target is really everyone in this webinar, and including the general public, parents, and all advocates in the ECD sector. The brief is 11 pages long, and in a short while, I'll go through the highlights of the different sections listed below. Next slide, please. So before I go into the details of the brief, I just want to talk about why we created this brief and what is our hope for this brief and all the other fact sheets that we're also developing. We want this brief to be a practical tool for folks in the ECD sector to use, and these are some suggestions as to how this can happen. First, you can download and distribute this brief directly to relevant stakeholders. Next, you can use the information in the brief to run a workshop or talk, or you can even adapt the information in the brief to create your own version of a brief or other communications materials. And this, for instance, was done on the air pollution brief in Indonesia last year. Or last but not least, you can take on specific call to action, or basically solutions that are recommended in the brief. And we also recognize that this brief is an evolving product, and we really welcome any suggestions you have for improvement, or any experience you would like to share back with us in using this brief. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll just give a brief highlight of the brief. So Neelima had touched on the fact that, we are in the region of really the highest risk of flooding exposure. And we also understand that flooding is an issue that impacts the low and middle income people the most. Next slide. And this is another way of looking at the map on the previous slide. It talks about the top 10 countries that are most vulnerable to floods, expressed as the number of people exposed to the flood risk. And if you take a look, you can see that the majority of these countries, in fact, 8 out of 10 of these countries are in Asia. Next slide. So Neelima had talked about climate change as one of the reasons why flooding is set to increase, as well as urbanization, because Asia has some of the biggest and most rapidly growing cities in the world, and in in urbanization, if it's not done systematically and sustainably, it results in a lot of removal of trees, vegetation, and soil, which absorb water, or the alteration of these natural drainage systems. So if it's done in an unplanned fashion, we can expect to see a lot more urban floods. There's also the issue of land subsistence, and this is not covered that heavily in this brief, but I did do a bit of research on it for this webinar. So land subsistence, it refers to the gradual sinking of the ground, primarily from the over-extraction of groundwater. And if you look at the chart on the top right side of this slide, you will see that the proportion of globally affected area and globally affected population, the majority of people affected are belonging in our region once again. And as if land subsistence isn't bad enough because it results in higher propensity for flooding, I also did some research and found that there is actually a lot of arsenic in the groundwater. Next slide, please. Yes, and you see that arsenic is a toxic heavy metal, and of course, children again are particularly vulnerable to arsenic poisoning. And you will see here that a vast majority, 94% of the population, the global population that will be affected by arsenic in groundwater is in Asia. So this is another pressing issue that maybe we can have another webinar another day. Next slide, please. So back to the issue of flooding, we also want to highlight that there are actually many different kinds of floods. Depending on where you stay, you might be exposed to river flooding, urban flooding, coastal flooding, especially a concern with sea level rise, and of course, urban flooding. Next slide, please. So Evelyn had touched on, and as well as Neelima had touched on the nurturing care framework, which we have here on the right-hand side. And I think many of you are familiar with this framework that highlights that for children to develop properly and healthily, they need to have not just good health, good nutrition, but responsive caregiving, safety and security, and opportunities for early learning. So in developing this fact sheet, we wanted to present how flooding impacts not just one area of nurturing care, but really all the components of nurturing care. So what we did is that we created this infographic where we listed out the reasons why flooding impacts the specific component. So this infographic is available in the fact sheet, and if anyone wants a soft copy to share with your stakeholders, or you want to adapt it in your local language, please feel free to reach out. So I won't go into detail with all these boxes, but let's just focus maybe on adequate nutrition, and we can see how flooding affects nutrition because livestock could be killed during the flood process. There could be crop failure, as well as a reduction in access to nutritious food. Next slide. Okay, so I've come to the closing part of my presentation, and this is also the end part of the flooding fact sheet, and it's the call to action side, which is sort of like the solutions, the interventions that you can take up. And we found that with this fact sheet, as well as the previous fact sheet, this is like the most popular and exciting part of the entire fact sheet, because with ARNEC, I find that a lot of people are can-do people who really want to get things done and not just focus on why things are not going well, but really focus on what can we do. So we have created this call to action section that has several suggestions as to what you can do at different levels, whether you're a parent or caregiver, whether you're an ECD advocate, or you work at a local community or CSO level, or whether you're at the highest level of a development partner or at the national policymaking level. So next slide, please. So we have a lot of suggestions under the different levels in the brief, but for the sake of this webinar, I think I will just highlight a couple of the suggestions. So for parents and caregivers, one of the suggestions we have is that they need to first understand the issue of flooding, why it's so important, how it impacts their children, as well as the risk of flooding in their neighborhood. And they also need to pair that with an understanding that the environment is evolving, especially with climate change. So it doesn't mean that just because you've never experienced a flood before that, there's no possibility of a flood ever happening. If you do live in a flood flood-prone area, it would be useful to develop an emergency plan with evacuation routes, emergency contacts, essential food, water, medicines, etc. And as Neelima had mentioned, flooding and other disasters really impacts the mental and emotional health of a child. So provide emotional support by proactively engaging with your child through talking, singing, and playing. And emotional and mental support is not just important for the child, but also for the caregiver. So be aware of your own level of mental and emotional distress as well, and seek professional help if necessary. Next slide, please. So at the ECD advocate and local government level, we suggest that, folks at this level can advocate for child-centered measures for flood preparation, response, and mitigation. So these include ensuring the continuity of education in the event of a flood, establishing robust child protection systems, because studies show that there's an increase in child labor, child trafficking, as well as violence against children in events of natural disasters, as well as the strengthening of health systems. And as well as incorporating flood education is okay. So the highest level here, if you're a development partner level or the national policymaker, we suggest an investment in flood prevention infrastructure and recovery services. And, I like to quote Singapore, where I'm from, whereby the Singapore government has invested a lot in expanding the man-made drainage system, our canals and drains, to absorb more stormwater. And this has really helped to reduce the propensity for flooding in our urban environment. So on the last point on the marginalized and vulnerable communities, I think I'll leave that to the next speaker, as he's an expert there, and he will expound a little bit more as to why we need to really give them more attention and care. So that ends my presentation, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for sharing the details about advocacy brief. Please do have a look at the advocacy brief. We have shared the link for the advocacy brief, and use it in your context. Yeah. So our next speaker is Nazar. So Nazar, over to you. Please do share insights about from your research, and also, about the department where you are doing more work related to climate change and how it is impacting different components for young children. Over to you, Nazar.
Okay. Thank you, Neelima. I'll just share my screen. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining in today. My name is Nazar Khalid, and I'm going to present some insights from a paper that we wrote last year, which is Floods and Children's Education in India. Okay, so quickly, I would like to begin this discussion today with a quote by Kathleen Tierney from her book, The Social Roots of Risk. And so Kathleen Tierney is a professor of sociology, now retired at the University of Colorado Boulder. And she's also a former director of the National Hazard Center there. And this quote let me read it out to you. It's a small quote. The study of disaster risk is inseparable from the study of hazard exposure and vulnerability. Part of the story of how risks are produced can be told through understanding the factors that increase the size and scale of exposures and that produce both physical and social vulnerability. However, a great deal of risk scholarship ignores these dimensions of risk, focusing instead on cognitive, psychological, and social psychological processes that are involved in how people think about risk. So essentially, what is sort of like a very brief summary of what her work does is to locate disasters into these social systems that we live in, sort of saying that disasters are social processes, right? So disasters occur when natural hazards, lead to extensive social disruption and loss. The impacts of disaster is shaped by economic, social, and cultural factors For instance, vulnerability of individuals is both a function of the physical risk that they are, and that the physical risks as well as their social context in which they live. Social inequalities, which are like inequalities of caste, religion, income, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, determine who is most vulnerable. And then, of course, there is this idea of intersectionality where we are saying that individuals might have multiple disadvantages, all of which go on to compound the effects that they eventually feel. For instance, one example could be that children of illiterate mothers from lower caste Hindu families. So there are multiple vulnerabilities here facing the child. And finally, that recovery depends on access to resources, which again is a function of the social inequality and the social context in which an individual resides. So, this here is this. This is a photo from recent floods from Patna in India, and this photo sort of gives a sense of like what I'm trying to argue in this presentation. So if you can see, like Patna is located on the banks of Ganga River. And, notice how the houses closer to the river, and of course those are the submerged houses, how these are very distinct from, say, buildings which are further away from the river, right? And do you think that it is by chance that an individual decided to live where they are living in this photo? Perhaps not. And this is the social roots that I'm talking about. Individuals make choices not because they are free to choose anything, but it is what their social context allows them to do. So next, I want to sort of move to discuss briefly about what we do in this paper. This is a paper that I co-authored with my professors at University of Pennsylvania, Jerry Behrman, Emily Hannam, and Amrit Thapa, and where we look at the impact of floods on India, children from rural India. So so briefly giving you a sense of like the data that we use the data from the Indian Human Development Survey, which is a nationally representative panel survey, which means that children were observed over time between 2004-5 and 2011-12. We look at children, we focus only on children who are aged 8 to 11 years old in the survey. And we look at 3 different types of education outcomes. We look at grade 4 age, which is number of grades completed relative to age. Then we look at children's math and reading scores. This is based on simple language and arithmetic tests that they were given in their houses. And we use this data set because this data set sort of focuses on learning outcomes and not as against like the other sort of data sets which usually look only at the enrollment. This data set, the test scores that we look at in terms of our outcomes, these tests were administered at their home. So that sort of minimizes bias. And it also has very rich set of information on household characteristics, along with also collecting information on village level flood exposure. Okay, so this was the data set. Now let me briefly sort of take you through what we find in our paper. And I will not go into any technical details of how we set up the research in our paper. But so this figure here talks about flood exposure among the children in our survey. So the figure shows the level exposure for children from different income groups, which is the first section here, and different caste and religious groups. The x-axis in my figure shows the percentage exposed, which goes from 0 to 45. And the length of these bars actually indicate what percent of children within these groups were exposed to floods. So if we just focus on the income quintiles first, we can see that as we move from the richest income quintile to the poorest income quintile, the length of these bars sort of increase, right? And if we focus on the poorest income quintile, which is the children from the poorest, most vulnerable sections of our society, we see that almost 4 in 10 children are exposed to floods or live in areas which are exposed to floods. Then let's look at the caste and religious identities of these children. And as you can see, we have these 3 bars which are shaded in red. And these indicate higher flood exposure. And if you look at what communities these children belong to, this is Muslims, Hindu scheduled caste or Hindu ST, Hindu SC, and Hindu other backward caste, which is Hindu OBC. So essentially, Hindu SC and Hindu OBCs are marginalized social caste groups within Hindus. And what this figure tells us that the marginalized Muslims and marginalized Hindu caste groups are more likely to be exposed to floods compared to, say, Hindu upper caste or others, which includes Christians and some other smaller religion. So that's our first insight, that vulnerable people, marginalized children from marginalized groups are more likely to be exposed to floods than less marginalized children. The second insight from our paper is that looks at the impact of floods on children's educational outcomes. So for the same 2 groups, caste, religion, and income quintiles, I'm going to show how children from these groups performed in math test. But I'm going to show that by their level of flood exposure. So the darker bars that you see here indicate children who are not exposed to floods in our data, and the lighter blue bars are ones who are exposed to floods. And the math test score goes from 0 to 4, where 4 is the best performance, the best score, and 0 is the worst score. So there are 2 things that can be noticed from this figure. One is that, all these lighter blue bars are shorter than the darker blue bars. I mean, there are like some anomalies, but more or less that's the pattern, right? So what this says is that children who are flood exposed in our sample tend to perform worse than children who are not flood exposed in math test. So that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that, as you can see, the height of these bars actually vary by the marginalization status of these children, right? So Hindu OBC, which is Hindu other backward caste, and Hindu SC, which is Hindu scheduled caste, the bars are shorter than, say, Hindu upper caste, which is like the more privileged group in India. And similarly, if you look at Muslims, sort of like shorter than Hindu upper caste. Similarly here, as you move from low incomes to high incomes, the length of this bar slightly increase, suggesting that marginalized groups to begin with have lower education outcomes, and floods make it even worse, right? I show in this figure, the next figure shows the same, shows the performance in reading test scores for the same 2 groups of children. And as you can see from the figure, the pattern is very similar, even in terms of the performance in reading test, right? The third insight is related to this idea, like this idea that suppose that, when a village gets flooded, do education of children from marginalized communities suffer more adversely than children from privileged groups? In our paper, we look at differences by different axes of marginalization. So we look at incomes, we look at caste and religious identities, we look at parental education, we look at sex, we look at household occupation, and we find that two types of marginalization actually are in we find evidence for two types of marginalization leading to additional harmful effects when children get exposed to floods. So the first is poorer children suffer more severe flood effects from floods, particularly in grade 4 age progression. They're less likely to stay at pace in the grade with their age, right? And the second is that girls experience more negative effects than boys, especially in math achievement. But what is, and this is a good news that we sort of a good news that we see in our analysis, that other kinds of marginalization by caste and religious groups, or by household occupation or parental education, there's no distinction between. This is not to say that children are not affected, it's just that children are affected, but there's no difference by their marginalization status. And the last point that I want to make, sort of summarizing what we kind of found collectively in the three insights that I just presented, is that disproportionate harm or disproportionate effect on educational outcomes of marginalized children is more likely due to differential exposure, like they have lower or poorer educational outcomes because they're more likely to be exposed to floods, rather than differences in the effects after their flooding.
Nazar,
So
sorry,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, Nazar. If you can just wrap up, I'm sure we'll take up all these interesting points in the discussion also. Yeah.
Okay. I
Thanks.
just have
Yeah.
I'll just take one more minute. Okay. So sort of like, I was talking about, I began with Kathleen Turner's quote, and then I presented my insights. I want to sort of bring all of that together to make the following point, which might be policy relevant for people in the audience today. So one is that the intersection of climatic and social vulnerabilities complicates intervention design. So these multiple overlapping disadvantages intersect with climate risks, making it difficult to disentangle the direct and indirect effects on education. So for instance, like while privileged groups have higher resilience, they also experience more absolute damage due to their greater resources. On the other hand, marginalized children who are already on the edge are pushed into deeper deprivation by small shocks. So then the key point really is like, when we are designing policies, how much should we trade off universalism versus tailored or local or group-specific vulnerabilities? And I think sort of understanding the social roots of these processes might help us make that choose effective policies which sort of cater to one or the other groups. And finally, like I want to end here, is that we also need to look beyond school-based interventions. There's a tendency amongst policymakers sort of to start, if you're looking at education, then start from school-based approaches, but then marginalized children may be excluded from school even before floods happen. So it is important for us to sort of like, keep this social roots idea in mind when we are looking at who might get excluded from education. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
No, I think there are a lot of interesting, insights that you've shared, and how layered this entire thing is. We cannot look at the climatic events or disasters or flooding or whatever through just one lens. We have to look at it from different lens and understand it accordingly. So there are a lot of questions in the chat box for you, Nazar. If you could just go through them and try and respond to them. We'll also take up these questions, once you've done with the panel discussions or from the country sharings. So we'll take them up also. But in the meantime, if you can just respond to those questions, it will be really nice. A lot of interest generated, we can see through your research. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So now, moving on to, you've presented on a global aspect of climate change on the region. We've talked about flooding. We've also talked about the advocacy brief, and you've also heard from a research how, various layers are there which impact children. And although the research was done for 8 to 11-year age group, but I'm sure the findings can also be related to the younger age group that we are talking about here. So now moving on to uh, how does it look at the ground level? How do countries, we have our panelists from various countries. So I will invite, I'll start with Joy. She's from Philippines, and we've heard a lot about the flooding and the storms in Philippines, and how are they affecting children in Philippines, and how is Philippines addressing this issue? So over to you, Joy, to share about the country perspective.
Thank you, Neelima. And good day, everyone. So my presentation sheds light on the severe and lasting impacts of flooding on young children in the Philippines, including children with disabilities and indigenous peoples. Save the Children ensures that every child's rights is prioritized, even amidst climate-induced disasters. Next slide, please. The Philippines has been ranked the most disaster-prone country for 3 consecutive years. Annually, 20 typhoons trigger floods and landslides, affecting children's rights to survival, development, and protection and participation. About 78% of schools are at risk, worsening an already dire learning crisis with a 90% learning poverty rate. National policies like the Children's Emergency Relief and Protection Act are in place, but ECCD in emergency is still less prioritized. Next slide. Flooding severely impacts young children's right to health, safety, and development. Floods expose them to deadly diseases like dengue and leptospirosis and force them to navigate hazardous environment filled with debris and unsafe water. For children with disabilities, IP children, and those living in poverty, the risks multiply. Lack of access to health care, therapy, or disability-friendly evacuation centers worsens their plight. Food insecurity deepens with 28.8% of children under 5 already stunted. Evacuation centers are often only provide instant food, lacking the nutrients these children desperately need. And the psychological scars are just as deep due to separation from parents and the constant fear of flash floods. School disruptions, limited social interaction and play, and trauma from evacuations deeply affect children and caregiver interactions. Next slide. As part of ARNEC, Save the Children believes young children are among the most vulnerable but are valuable asset in the fight against climate inequalities. We apply our STEPS framework for protecting children's rights. We focus on 4 key areas: enhancing service delivery, empowering families, providing targeted support for most excluded children, and lastly, strengthening social and structural systems. Next slide. Allow me to share our service delivery strategies. So we embed climate adaptation and DRR preparedness into ECCD programs through engaging resources like Where Will I Go and Solving Climate and Weather Mysteries. Children and families learn how to stay safe during emergencies like the flooding and adapt to the impacts. Our media partnership has brought inclusive climate-focused learning resources into 1.9 million homes and schools, ensuring children with disabilities and IP children can become advocates for climate action. Together with local governments and the ECCD Council, we integrate strategies into DRR plans through ECCD and emergency, prioritizing safe play spaces, health services, and psychosocial support. Next slide. Empowering families to protect children's rights is crucial. We've reached thousands of caregivers with video-based parenting sessions on how to protect young children during floods and other emergencies. Cash assistance to vulnerable families and households ahead of disasters allows them to plan and secure essentials. Working with IP Group and special education schools, we empower older children to lead climate awareness sessions, recognizing the critical yet often overlooked needs of younger children. Next slide. Protecting children's rights requires long-term sustainable solutions. We are modeling inclusive ECCD responses by pre-positioning ECCD kits and evidence-based advocacy. We ensure evacuation centers are safe, responsive, climate-informed, and inclusive for young children, pregnant, and lactating mothers. We also work with the Department of Social Welfare and Development to integrate mental health and well-being support into our social protection program and its frontline workers. Our advocacy extends to localized comprehensive emergency plans for children and expanding school safety to include children aged 0 to 4. Next slide. So no child should be left behind. We strengthen child find systems and service mapping, ensuring every child has access to ECCD services and support to their families. Our programs like Building Brains for under 3 and Ready to Learn for 3 to 5 years old bring holistic support to children and their families using intersectional lens, as mentioned earlier by Nazar, while challenging traditional caregiving by involving fathers in emergency preparedness. A gender-equitable approach to caregiving ensures that all children, especially in disaster-prone areas, receive the nurturing care they need. Finally, next slide. Save the Children is committed to safeguarding children's rights in the face of climate change. Together with the government, CSOs, and the private sector, we're creating a climate-responsive ECCD systems that don't just protect, but empower families. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy. Very interesting presentation. Thank you for sharing your experiences from Philippines and the amazing innovative work that you're doing. And we'll have a discussion on this, on the various approaches and the strategies that you've outlined. So thank you again. Moving to our next speaker from Bangladesh, Mourie. Mourie, please share what is happening in Bangladesh with respect to flooding and young children and how you are addressing the issue.
Thank you very much, Neelima. Super excited to hear Joy's presentation because it's very innovative and there is a lot to learn. I'm sure after this meeting, I will get in touch with Joy for learning more. Every picture has a story, so I want to start by that. As you can see on the screen, this is a picture taken in June during a flood. Basically, these young children were playing in a rickshaw on a dam, on a broken dam actually. They took shelter on the broken dam because they did not have anywhere else to go immediately when the flood happened. Although looking at these children, it's like it gives me hope, and it also puts me, I think, puts us on toes, keeps us on toes to do something for them, because the way they are, the way I interpret this picture is that although they look very happy, but as they will be missing, or they are missing on so many critical elements of their lives in terms of their care, food, protection, education, all those are compromised due to devastating floods. And just behind the rickshaw, there is a steep steep, how would I say, the river is just not the river, the flood water is just right beside them. And it also tells me the story that they are so unprotected and nobody is really keeping an eye on them. With that note, let me start my presentation. I'm Mourie Chowdhury, working with UNICEF as education specialist. My main focus, as Neelima has introduced me before, is on early learning and education in emergency. I also co-lead the National Education Cluster. Today, I will actually shed some light or share my experience of recent floods, taking that into account and the challenges we are facing. It is, as I was hearing all the presentations, it is, to be very honest, reconfirmation of the presentation that yes, we are still struggling and struggling with floods' impact on young children, and for Bangladesh, it is still a long way to go. Next slide, please. So with starting with some basic facts, I'm sure most of you already know it. Bangladesh population is 171 million. It borders with India, Myanmar, and the Bay of Bengal. It's mainly deltaic floodplains. It's very little amount of highlands. It is above 15 meters or less around the coastal areas above the sea level. And we have major 5 rivers, but we have almost 230 rivers across the country. Climate is moist, humid, tropical monsoon climate. I'm just saying it so that the impact of flood you can assess. In terms of climate risk, Bangladesh is ranked 7th among the countries which are most affected by climate extreme weather. Cyclone storms, flood, heat waves are very common phenomenon. It is the 15th out of 163 countries where children are at most risk of climate change. We have around 20 million children seriously exposed to climate hazards, and as you can see on your right, there is a multi-hazard map. The darker colors represent 6 or more hazards, people exposed in those areas. And then 12 million children in Bangladesh live near the river areas, which are very highly prone to flooding. Next slide, please. So this is just a glimpse of how the flood situation occurs. From here, I would say that every 10 to 12 years, there is a serious flooding happening. And particularly this year, we have had 2 floods starting from June till today. It's ongoing. There is a risk of another flooding, so warning is going on. We are still we might get more cyclones in the coming cyclone season in October, November. So this is just to give a glimpse of the situation of flood. The blue colors are the flood affected areas that are representing. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of this year, I wanted to focus on this year because this year was quite unique in the sense that we had a cyclone and a flash flood following that cyclone, of course, was in May. And then June, we had a flood in the northeastern region. And in August, which continued, by the way, with waterlogging and all. And then in August, we had a new flood coming in. In total, according to OCHA, 18.3 million people has been affected by cyclone and flood since May, of which around 4 million are children. This is also, it is unique in terms of August flood, because the region that was hit by the August flood was not a flood prone area. So all the preparedness, it was it was not prepared. The areas were not people, the people were not prepared for the flood. They did not anticipate the flood coming. So as a result, the sufferings was much higher than other times. As you know, Bangladesh is quite well known in the world about how they tackle flood. But this time, this August flood was very unpredicted, and early warning system was not enough. Can we go to the next slide, please? In terms of my background is education, so I see many things through the lens of education. However, as we all know that definitely the points that was raised earlier, that what are the disruptions caused, and we have by flood, and we have also seen the same kind of thing in terms of healthcare services that was disrupted. People could not go to vaccinate their children, access essential medical care, and we, particularly for children, we know that during these floods are caused by monsoon rain, and there are a lot of children who are suffering from cold, but they cannot go to the centers for essential services. There was an increased risk of waterborne diseases. There was a particular time when everybody was alerted because there was a slight uptake in the diarrhea outbreak. So everybody was alerted, and people and the service provider and the organizations have taken necessary actions to prevent that. Thankfully, it did not happen, but it could have happened, and that would have been a worse scenario. They also suffer, young children also suffer from respiratory infections because often the shelter centers are heavily crowded, and everybody has some sort of respiratory problem or cold or flu or things like infectious diseases, and they are very easy to catch. In terms of child protection, definitely there are separation issues, separated from families, because particularly for this flood, in both the cases, both the floods, we have seen tidal flow and very strong water breaking the dam, coming into their houses, and so people were not really prepared. So people had to leave their children on a basket or something like that so that they can survive. So there were a lot of incidents in terms of family separation. I have personally met a few children who were separated from the families, and now they are in a shelter where the child does not know anyone. You will see one of the pictures of such a child where the community is taking care of that child and nobody knows whose children are they. So those kind of situations are there. Of course, we all know that it creates a lot of stress and anxiety. And if you visit a flood shelter, you will see a lot of young children are crying, screaming, agitated. So it's a lot of mental stress on them. Shelters are often, although shelters are often in the school, as many of you have already said, but they are so overcrowded that they don't have safe space for the children. And there is no corner, for example, for children to play. The children are roaming around wherever they want to. They are playing in the mud, they are playing with the water, and all those practical things that you can expect in a shelter. But actually, because the shelters are managed by the district administration, and district administration do not necessarily understand the specific needs of those children, of that age group of children. And this time we have seen it so strongly.
Maury, sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry. If you could just, wrap it up and, yeah, please do that. Yeah.
So in terms of education, the problem is common for anywhere. loss of play materials. So children cannot play. Schools are closed, and parents don't necessarily prioritize even when they go back home. They don't prioritize sending their young children back to pre-primary classes or early learning classes. So that remains a challenge. Let's go to the next slide, please. In terms of nutrition, my personal experience, I would only share instead of reading it. So, for example, the breastfeeding corner, there is no breastfeeding corner in the community that we live in. So parents don't feel like feeding their children more often because it will expose themselves. They don't have a privacy. They also, particularly in this case, there was a lot of volunteering support from the public for the flood affected people, but we had to really tell them not to provide children's food because often they are bringing milk products, which people don't necessarily maintain the hygiene or measurement, proper ratio and things like that, which is causing health concerns. All these also stresses the parent out. The caregiver also gets stressed, and they don't necessarily have resources and support for supporting their children. And yeah, and shall we go to the next slide? List of challenges are quite long. I would I would
Just summarize the few, and then
Yeah.
definitely our participants are reading them on the slide.
Yeah.
You could just summarize.
So in terms of the challenges, definitely the policies are not really child-friendly, especially emergency-related, disaster-related policies. So they don't cater. And a big challenge that we face is lack of funding. People don't prioritize child protection, education, ECD at this point during emergency. Even for recovery, it is difficult to get funding. So that's a big area that we are facing challenges. And in terms of implementation challenges, data is a major challenge. We don't have data, and we don't collect data in terms of what is the malnutrition condition and how many children under 5 are being affected and what is the impact and things like that. So I will highlight these as major challenges. In terms of, yeah, shall we go to the next slide, please?
Maury, I think we have one more country presentation.
Yeah,
So,
the last one. The
yeah,
next
please,
slide is
very
the last
quickly.
one.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry for interrupting. It's just that,
No.
Baela is also waiting. Yeah.
Next slide, please. We definitely, I will only put one thing, although we are doing all the service related support that that the children are requiring, but one of the areas that we haven't done much is about how to establish child-friendly emergency shelters or creating, which is probably easier. So those are the areas that we need to promote more, advocate more for a child-friendly emergency shelters or space in the emergency shelters, and also flexible education solutions in order to protect children, while the other services with regard to health, nutrition, and community awareness goes on. Some of the advocacy briefs and materials will be very helpful to use in this regard. With that note, thank you very much. And I'm really sorry for taking so long.
No, I think, Maury, it was very interesting, and we are seeing the response in the chat also, very interesting presentation. There's a question on separation, what you mentioned, family separation also. So if you can take that also, that will be really nice. And especially, I think you've hit the nail on the head when you say that a lot of district administrations, they don't know how to prepare for such situations, especially with respect to children in mind. So I think that is very relevant. So amazing, insights from your presentation. Thank you so much. Moving quickly to Baela, and then, we'll take some questions and, yeah. Baela, over to you.
Good afternoon over here, and namaste, and welcome everyone. Thank you to ARNEC for organizing a very important webinar at this particular juncture. There is just so much that has been said already by Evelyn, Neelima, Lynn, Nazar, Mariel, and Mourie, that from the country perspective and the theoretical framing, I think I hope I'll zip by mine pretty fast. Next slide, please. So if we look at the issue of climate change in early years, these are now recurrent emergencies. There's no time to recover. And we've seen from the presentations that vulnerable, of course, again and again are most impacted. Not just them alone, but they are the ones who are most impacted with increasing food insecurity. There's already in Pakistan a backlog of low multi-sectoral indicators. And we've seen the emphasis of multi-sectoralism in the way we approach this issue, whether it is health, nutrition, and education protection. And of course, we are looking at flooding and climate change in context of child development milestones. Pakistan ranks 5th on the Global Climate Change Risk Index and ranks 4th in the top 10 countries vulnerable to floods. With 245 million population, the stunting rate is 44%. Birth registration rate is sadly just 44% of children under 5. Early years coverage is 45% in urban and 30 to 35% in rural. And in the 2022 floods, we saw 1/3 country impacted, still not recovered, 33 million people, 50% children, and 9.4 million crops were destroyed. And just wanted to underscore, because I do want to highlight that, is 40% of the urban population lives in urban slums. So with a 40% urbanization rate and 40% in urban slums, this is a factor to think about. And with increased urban flooding and heat waves becoming a recurrent reality, we've seen repeated flooding from 2010 and then 22 and then 23 and 24. And by and large, for early years, we've seen that it's generally the response is always input-driven and short-term in emergencies. Next, please. So in the research that we do for Asar Pakistan on learning levels, in 2023, we asked, covering almost 118,000 households across 150 districts. Nationally, 20% households reported that children's schooling was extremely affected. But if we look at Sindh, 53% of schooling was affected. And in Balochistan, 43%, the two provinces which were most affected by the floods of 2022-23. And if we looked at household income losses, while 8% said that that 50% or more of their earnings were impacted due to natural disasters, but overall 48% of household income was affected. And then when we look at the issues of mental and psychological well-being of the household and children, we look at 23% of households reported their psychological well-being was substantially affected, while 13% indicated was somewhat affected. So these are, I think, when you frame things like that, it's certainly something that we need to look at more comprehensively. And this is the data we were asking to be able to better understand learning, in terms of gender, in terms of household wealth, in terms of geography, etc. So that report is there, and we'll always give you the link for the ASA report and our policy briefs on climate change and children's learning. Next, please. Next slide. And if we look at case studies, that is also part of the brief that ARNEC is prepared, that it impacts the young. The young talk about it. The young know it. They feel it. Those traumas remain, and they keep on coming again and again. So it's not as if it goes away. But remember, it's not just faced by the child alone, but in a kind of in a group setting. It impacts the household. And I think it's so important what Nazar said. We're not just looking at the school as the frame, but the community and the household. Next, please. And so if we look at urban slums, which is, I just call it the forgotten sprawl with huge unmet needs. So if you look at Pakistan's population, 40% living in urban areas, and out of which 40% living in urban slums, we have all those other challenges of domestic migration on the rise in new and existing urban slums. The oldest slums already are overcrowded places with many unmet needs of shelter, health, sanitation, education, skills protection. But where the normal basic services are very ad hoc and infrequent. However, at the same time here, we have communities which are full of resilience. They are trying to build their lives again. There's diversity of language, of culture. The women and youth-led enterprises we can see again and again. And these are drawn from the studies that we are doing in urban slums of Asar, but also from the Karachi Urban Unit and others who are looking at urban slums. But we see high mobile usage. We see on learning, by the way, that compared to urban and rural, urban slums are performing less than the urban and rural usual learning results for foundational learning. But there is a tremendous spirit of self-help going beyond the victim vulnerable syndrome, because that community has to rise. And you can see on the right hand, this is the Karachi Urban Labs, Karachi's urban flooding zone in this mega city. So this is, of course, right now looking at flooding, but also they've done great heat maps of heat actually in the urban slums as well. Next, please. So data is getting better. You can do better targeting. And then this whole notion of child undernutrition, which we saw increased by 50%, which includes wasting, stunting, and underweight together. And as we know, stunting is irreversible. There's challenges of low learning and, of course, intergenerational impact when young girls and women, and we have the case of the monsoon brides as well now because of flooding and climate change, getting married early, but giving birth to low weight babies. But the recent assessment of 43 rural districts in 3 provinces shows by those most affected by the floods that 29% of the population was really suffering from hunger and food insecurity. And of course, the prices are on the rise for food, and also inflation has peaked in Pakistan, and we hope that there'll be better situation. There, of course, the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, which is also in the region. Pakistan is a member addressing issues of 0 to 5. But I think I wanted to really also focus on issues of biological development and environment. And we have touched upon it because we're looking at the biological development from the point of view of brain development, metabolism, immune systems, and how environment it has a deep connection with it. Environments address issues or impact issues of the biological development, whether it is also physical, mental health, learning, social and emotional well-being. So and I think whilst we are focusing on floods and water, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Both air and temperature affect all those developmental aspects of environment that in turn affects the child's holistic development. So, of course, we see that climate change is no more a future threat, and we've seen it in Bangladesh, in so many countries, Philippines, etc., that this is a recurrent phenomenon now. The thought of working in just for climate change as an emergency one-off is no more. This is a concurrent reality, and sadly, our planning processes remain divided between what is seen as DRR and preparation, etc., separate to what are seen as mainstream planning and development. Here, of course, we are looking at not just children under threat, but learning and generations are under threat. Next, please. So, of course, we need to think, and I'm finishing up. So how do we frame this better? Because the issue of response is not just, as I said, of course, it's the affected, the victims, but it is also the survivors and people who are building the resilience. There's a science behind it, which is beyond survival. So how do you look at really framing of a science of preparedness and awareness, which is in continuity? The preparedness strategies are part of the life skills which are in home and in schools and communities. Looking at green infrastructure and plantation, both at home and in the communities, in the schools. And I think that's a whole new shift which has to go. And we've seen some very exciting solutions that are emerging from the region on what was seen as I would say, heritage solutions to how you keep homes cool. How do you create fridges without electricity? How do you look at cooking in a very different way? And I think it's looking at those material alternative choices in construction, services, cooking, cooling, that I think, we need to think, beyond this syndrome of an emergency or a climate change as a one-off event, as we've seen so well, really brilliantly stated today. And which includes, of course, the nurturing prayer framework and the dimensions and the responses of Bangladesh, India, and on that, and Philippines on that. That how are we looking at a very compromised nurturing care framework because of the climate change? How do you design, knowing full well that that has been undermined from what its aspirations are meant to be? So I was just thinking more, we've been doing work in maker arts and maker crafts and so on. How do you create these makeries, like bakeries? How do you create those open learning activities or spaces where children, parents, teachers can really look at the whole, the design for change movement, where you're feeling the challenge, imagining the solutions, trying to test it, do it, and then share it. So it needs to have come up with that kind of an agency for change, where you are communities of practice and children and everyone affected is coming up with ways to solve their own challenges across those dimensions, those multi-sectoral dimensions. And of course, the resilient activities at home, community centers. I sometimes think about myself. At age 4, I remember every trauma that has affected me, and that has built reserves of resilience. Because I want to try to overcome. And I think each one of us, children from rich and poor homes, all feel that. How do you create that as a great reservoir of response within yourselves and within the communities? And we've seen that happen more and more. And I did want to say one more thing. I was in APMED recently in Bangkok, and I said, we do not think of this, that we have so many open source materials. We are looking at large reservoirs of solutions that are coming up, which are all open source. Do we really use those open source materials in a very constructive manner? Because they are available to anyone. This new knowledge is coming out for everyone to take and make sense of it in their own context and localize it. So, and of course, as I mentioned, the learning across networks of practice, whether it is ARNEC, Moving Minds Alliances, the Lego Schools 2030, etc. And I did, as I participate in many campaigns, including the ARNEC campaign that is building so beautifully and richly with so many participants on climate change in early years. If you just go to my last final slide, it is really calling to action, as we saw in the summit, the future summit at the next slide, where there was a call for action for early years. That's when inequality sets in. And I love the work that the world has done, which is looking at this manifesto, which is for Early Childhood Development Global Campaign, where you're looking at the butterfly effect, what the evidence says of investing in early years. And I want to end on a very sad note and a note of hope that when I started looking just 2 days ago on data on financing of early years, it is almost impossible to find where those financing budget lines are. We are fighting for finance as an ARNEC um, network, but everywhere the issues of finance for early years and what we are promoting as a holistic framework for not just the young but multi-generation, that funding is not there. So how do we do all of this and act for early years? This is really the larger question. And I urge everyone to also sign on this. This is available. The materials are there. But like ARNEC, we are part of very big movements, which is asking early years to be repositioned in a very systematic, fundamental, and strategic manner so that we are able to bring together the multi-sectoral aspect of early years, not just for learning and survival and protection in early years, but really for lifelong learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beta. Thank you for highlighting so many important aspects, sharing experiences from Pakistan and also talking about the community-based approach and self-help spirit. I mean, also, how do we institutionalize? How do we scale up these responses? How do we make use of the traditional approaches that we had? So amazing presentation there. Thank you, Beta. And also in the end, highlighting that, we need to come together to work together and collaborate in order to promote regarding this particular piece. I would have loved to take a lot of questions and some ask. I also had few questions for our panelists, but I think we've run 15 minutes over our time, and still there are participants in the webinar, which shows that it was a really interesting presentation, and this is a topic which is concerning, which touches each one of us who's working with young children. So once again, thanking all the panelists for their valuable insights, their presentations. There are a lot of questions, and this is not, it's not like this. It is done. This is the start. We are further promoting and advocating for this thematic of working on the intersection of ECD and climate for young children. Join our advocacy. You can visit our next page and learn more about it. Share your insights with us. We would, as Lynn mentioned, the advocacy brief is not the final thing. We can always incorporate your inputs for the advocacy briefs, and there are others which are coming out. So please join us also in our effort. And I would also like to thank Jiao for all the technical support for the platform and for all the the support that he's providing behind the curtain. Thank you, Jahao. Please do write to us. You can, we'll try and answer the questions. We'll give it to the experts. We'll try and answer the questions and send them across. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you very much for all your support.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.